Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep on a topic that never seems to really, leave the headlines: tariffs, trade wars. It's always there, lurking, and we got some really interesting excerpts actually from a piece called "The False Promise of Tariffs," a critical analysis. So I think this is going to be a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah, I mean it's a hot button issue for sure, and what's interesting is that the appeal I think of tariffs is pretty bipartisan. I mean, you see both, Republicans and Democrats, throughout history kind of turning to them as a way to, fix trade imbalances or deal with job losses. It's kind of a common thread.
Yeah, it's like the go-to lever that everyone seems to want to pull, when things aren't going quite right with the economy or with trade. But I'm curious about is, do tariffs actually deliver on that promise? I mean, our source material here seems to be suggesting that they don't.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the core argument here is that tariffs often fail to achieve, what they're supposed to achieve, and often they can actually kind of backfire and hurt the very, industries and workers they're supposed to be protecting.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the source material itself.
hmm
It seems to take a pretty deep dive into the history of U.S. trade policy. Was there anything that kind of jumped out at you in that section?
Well, I mean, the back and forth between, protectionism and free trade is really striking. It's like we as a country can't really decide which way we want to go. And Professor Richard Wolff, whose perspective is kind of woven throughout this whole analysis, he offers a pretty interesting take on these kind of policy swings.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does Professor Wolf have to say?
Well, he argues that these shifts aren't necessarily driven by like objective, economic,
Yeah.
principles or wisdom, right? It's more about kind of the competing interests of different groups of capitalists.
So it's less about what's best for the country as a whole, and more about who is kind of winning out in terms of powerful interest at any given time.
That's Wolf's argument, yeah, and he points out that both, Democrat and Republican administrations have, at times really enthusiastically embraced free trade and globalization, with this belief that like, the benefits would eventually trickle down to everyone.
Right.
But as we've seen, that doesn't always happen.
Right. It's almost like this pendulum that keeps swinging back and forth, but the average worker is never quite sure, if they're ever going to actually catch a break. Now, the source also spends a good chunk of time focusing on the Trump administration's tariffs. Why the focus on that period in particular?
Well, I mean, it was a pretty dramatic shift in U.S. trade policy right after decades of kind of generally leaning towards free trade. The Trump administration came in and really imposed some substantial tariffs on goods from various countries, most notably China. And I think this created a kind of a real world experiment where economists could actually study the impact of these tariffs in a way that hadn't been possible before.
Okay, so what did that experiment reveal? Did the tariffs achieve what they set out to do?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. I think, the data actually shows that the trade deficit, which was a key target of these tariffs, actually worsened under the Trump administration. And even more concerning is there's research by Federal Reserve economists that suggests that industries and counties that were more exposed to the tariffs actually saw reductions in employment.
Wow. Okay, so the tariffs seem to have actually backfired, both in terms of the trade deficit and job creation. That's pretty significant. But why would tariffs, which are supposed to protect domestic industries, end up having this negative impact?
Well, the source kind of digs into the mechanics of how tariffs work, and they point to a few key reasons why they can fail. Um, for starters, tariffs on imported components, what economists call, intermediate goods, actually raise production costs for U.S. manufacturers.
So even if you're trying to protect a finished product, like let's say cars, for example, the tariffs on the steel or the other parts that go into those cars are actually making them more expensive to produce here in the U.S.
Exactly. And that makes American manufacturers less competitive,
Yeah.
both domestically and internationally.
Yeah.
And then you have this issue of retaliatory tariffs, right? So when the U.S., imposes tariffs on another country, that country often retaliates with tariffs of its own on U.S. exports.
So it's like this tit-for-tat trade war that ends up kind of hurting businesses on both sides.
Exactly. And then on top of that, we can't forget about the impact on consumers, right? I mean, tariffs act as a tax on businesses and consumers. So that raises prices on everything from, cars to washing machines to groceries. And this is something that hits lower and middle income households particularly hard.
Right. Yeah. So those everyday expenses that really start to add up. Okay, so we've got these unintended consequences, higher production costs, retaliatory tariffs, higher prices for consumers. It's starting to paint a pretty clear picture of why tariffs, so often fail to deliver on their promises.
Yeah.
But I'm still left wondering why they remain so popular politically. What is it about tariffs that makes them such a tempting tool for policymakers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Professor Wolff, I think, offers a pretty compelling explanation. He argues that the debate over tariffs is less about economics and more about class dynamics.
Okay.
It's about the competing interests of different groups within the capitalist system.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Mm.
What do you mean by class dynamics?
Well, Wolff argues that, different groups of capitalists see tariffs as beneficial to their, particular industries, even if it hurts the economy as a whole, right? So for example, a steel manufacturer might lobby for tariffs on imported steel to protect, their profits, even though those tariffs will make it more expensive for other industries that use steel to produce their
So
goods.
it's a zero-sum game where one industry kind of benefits at the expense of others.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Wolf says that, capitalists often try to get workers to support their position on tariffs by using, nationalist rhetoric, right, framing trade as this battle between us and them.
Right, and I can see how that would be effective. It's a lot easier to rally people around the flag than it is to explain the complexities of international trade.
Exactly. But the reality, according to Wolf, is that tariffs create winners and losers even among American workers.
Can you give an example of how that plays out?
Sure, let's go back to the auto industry example, right? If you impose tariffs on imported cars to protect American auto workers, that might sound good on the surface, but what about all the other industries that use cars as part of their business?
Right, I see where you're going with this delivery companies. Taxi services, businesses with large fleets,
Hmm.
they're all going to have to pay more for their vehicles.
Exactly. And that can lead to job losses in those industries. So you might save some jobs in one sector, but you end up costing jobs in others.
So it's not as simple as just protecting American jobs. It's about understanding, the interconnectedness of the economy and how these policies can have these ripple effects, across different industries and different groups of workers.
Precisely. And I think this is where Professor Wolff's analysis is so important. It challenges us to look beyond, these simplistic narratives and think about the deeper dynamics at play.
This is definitely making me rethink some of my own assumptions about tariffs. Before we move on, are there any other common misconceptions about tariffs that we should address?
Yeah, there's a couple of big ones that our source material tackles head on.
Great. Let's dive into those.
The first one is this idea that a trade deficit is automatically like a bad thing. You hear people talking about it like we're losing to China or other countries because we're buying more from them than they buy from us.
Yeah, that's a common one for sure. It
Good.
always comes up, especially during campaign season.
Right. But, it's important to remember that trade isn't a zero-sum game, right? A
Yeah.
trade deficit doesn't mean we're being ripped off. It just means we're buying more goods and services from another country than we're selling to them at that particular moment.
Right.
I think the source uses a really helpful analogy to kind of illustrate this.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It compares it to like buying groceries from your local supermarket, right? If you buy more groceries from the supermarket than they buy from you, you have a trade deficit with the supermarket.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you're losing money or being taken advantage of.
Right. It just means you're buying more groceries.
Exactly. What's the other misconception?
The other one I think that we see a lot is this idea that tariffs are a good way to raise revenue for the government,
Right.
which, they do generate revenue, don't they? I remember reading somewhere that, tariffs brought in billions of dollars, for the U.S. government.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they do generate revenue, but the catch is that, if the tariffs are effective, they're so effective that
Yeah.
they actually reduce imports, then they won't actually generate any revenue.
Right, because there's nothing to tax.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, if the government is collecting a lot of revenue from tariffs, it means they haven't actually succeeded in reducing imports.
So you can't really have it both ways.
Yeah.
You can't use tariffs to effectively protect domestic industries and generate significant revenue at the same time.
Right. And we also have to remember that revenue that's being generated from tariffs is ultimately coming from American businesses and consumers, in the form of higher prices.
So it's basically a hidden tax.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And as we discussed earlier, these higher prices disproportionately impact lower and middle income households.
Right. They're the ones who really feel the pinch.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've debunked some common misconceptions about tariffs. We've kind of explored, Professor Wolff's arguments about these class dynamics at play. But But I'm still left wondering, if tariffs aren't the answer, what are some alternative approaches to addressing
Yeah.
these really complex economic issues?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And thankfully, our source material doesn't just critique tariffs; it also offers some potential solutions.
Okay, great. I'm eager to hear about those. What are some of the alternatives that the source highlights?
Well, one key area they focus on is investing in education worker training and infrastructure. The idea being that if we improve the skills of our workforce and modernize our infrastructure, we can make American businesses more competitive on a global scale.
So it's about investing in our future and not trying to, cling to the past.
Exactly. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about making strategic investments, focusing on industries and technologies that have the potential for, future growth, for example, investing in renewable energy technologies or advanced manufacturing. These are things that could create good paying jobs and boost American competitiveness in those sectors.
So it's about having a vision for the future and then aligning, our investments with that vision. I like that. What else does the source suggest?
Another key area they highlight is strengthening labor market policies. And this could involve things like raising the minimum wage, expanding access to affordable health care, making it easier for workers to organize and bargain collectively.
Yeah.
These are all policies that can help to create a more level playing field and ensure that workers benefit from economic growth.
It sounds like it's about creating a system where workers have more bargaining power and a greater share of the economic pie, regardless of what's happening with imports or exports.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that trade policy can't be separated from broader issues of economic justice and social equity.
So it's not just about trade, it's about creating, a fairer, more equitable society overall.
Right. And the last alternative approach that they kind of delve into is this idea of strategic industrial policy.
Now, this one always seems a bit controversial. Can,
Mhm.
can you explain what that involves and why it's sometimes seen as a risky strategy?
Sure. So strategic industrial policy is basically about the government taking a more active role in shaping the economy, by supporting specific industries that are seen as having the potential for future growth.
So instead of just letting the free market, run its course, the government would step in and say, hey, we're going to prioritize these industries because we believe they're going to be crucial to our economic success in the future.
Exactly. And this support can take various forms, like providing tax breaks or subsidies, investing in research and development, or creating a regulatory environment that favors those industries.
I can see why this approach would be appealing, especially if you're concerned about, falling behind in strategically important sectors like renewable energy or artificial intelligence. But I can also see why people might be hesitant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the main concern is that it can be difficult for the government to accurately pick winners and losers,
Hmm.
right? There's always a risk that they'll end up supporting industries that ultimately fail and waste taxpayer money in the process.
And I imagine there are also concerns about, cronyism and corruption with well-connected companies, lobbying for government support, even if they don't deserve it.
Those are all valid concerns. Yeah. And that's why, if you're going to implement strategic industrial policy, it's crucial to do it in a way that's transparent and accountable. You need to have clear criteria for selecting industries. You need rigorous oversight to prevent abuse, and you need a willingness to adapt and change course if things aren't working.
So it's not a magic bullet,
Yeah.
but it's a tool that if used carefully and strategically could potentially help to, boost innovation and create high-quality jobs.
That's a good way to put it. And it's important to note that, many countries, including some of the most economically successful ones, have used strategic industrial policy to their advantage. Think about the role that the U.S. government played in the early development of the internet or the aerospace industry.
Okay, so there are precedents for this approach. And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily as radical as some people make it out to be, but it's definitely a complex topic with a lot of potential pitfalls.
It definitely is, but I think it's a conversation worth having, especially as we think about how to create a more equitable and sustainable economic future.
Well said. This has been a really insightful exploration of tariffs and the potential for, alternative approaches to trade and economic policy.
I agree, and I think it's important to emphasize that we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore and unpack.
Absolutely, and that's where our listeners come in. We encourage you to dive deeper into the source material, do your own research, and continue to grapple with these complex issues. We'll provide links to everything we've discussed in the show notes.
That's right. We believe that the best way to learn is by, actively engaging with the material, challenging your own assumptions, and forming your own conclusions.
So with that in mind, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll continue to explore these alternative approaches in more detail and consider what a more equitable and sustainable economic future might actually look like. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. So we've been having, a really interesting conversation about tariffs and whether they actually, live up to the hype.
Mhm.
And well, it seems like the answer is often no, but the good news is our source material, the false promise of tariffs, it points to some pretty interesting alternative approaches to dealing with these issues. So I'm kind of curious to hear more about those.
Yeah, it has been a really thought-provoking discussion. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that economics, it's not just about numbers and graphs, it's about people's lives, right? It's about livelihoods, it's about hopes and dreams.
Mhm.
So as we explore these alternative approaches, I think it's important to keep in mind the human impact of these policies.
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the abstract theories and forget that we're talking about real people,
Right.
who are affected by these decisions. So let's dive back into those alternatives. We talked in the previous segment about investing in education, worker training, and infrastructure. Can you elaborate on how those investments, could actually make the American economy more competitive?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So when we invest in education and worker training, we're essentially investing in human capital, right? We're giving people the skills and knowledge they need to thrive in a rapidly changing economy.
So it's not just about teaching people how to do the jobs that exist today. It's about preparing them to the jobs of tomorrow.
Exactly. We need to be thinking about the skills that are going to be in high demand in the future. Things like, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, digital literacy. These are the skills that are going to allow workers to adapt and succeed in an increasingly automated and globalized world.
Right. That makes sense. And what about infrastructure? What role does that play in kind of boosting American competitiveness?
Well, when we talk about infrastructure, we're not just talking about roads and bridges,
Yeah.
although those are certainly important. We're also talking about digital infrastructure like broadband internet access and energy infrastructure, like smart grids and renewable energy sources.
So it's about creating kind of a foundation for businesses to thrive and for
Mhm.
workers to, connect and collaborate.
Precisely. Modern infrastructure is essential for businesses to operate efficiently, for workers to access opportunities, and for new ideas to flourish. It's
Mhm.
like creating, fertile ground for economic growth to take root.
I like that analogy. And it seems like
Mm.
these investments, in education, training, infrastructure, they would create a win-win situation,
Right.
right? Workers would benefit from, better skills and more opportunities, and businesses would benefit from a more productive and innovative workforce.
Exactly. It's a positive sum game, and I think that's what makes these alternatives so appealing. They're not about picking winners and losers, they're about creating an environment where everyone can succeed.
Okay, so that's one alternative approach. What else does our source material kind of point to?
Well, they also talk about the importance of strengthening labor market policies, things like raising the minimum wage, expanding access to affordable health care, making it easier for workers to join unions and bargain collectively. These are all policies that can help to create a more level playing field and ensure that workers have a greater share of the economic pie.
So it's about, making sure that the benefits of economic growth are more broadly shared and that workers have a voice in shaping their own economic destiny.
Exactly. And it's not just about fairness, it's also about economic efficiency. When workers are paid a living wage and have access to health care, they're more productive and they contribute more to the economy. It's a virtuous cycle.
Right. A healthier, more secure workforce is a more productive workforce.
Mm.
Okay, now the last alternative approach that we kind of touched on was this idea of strategic industrial policy, which is, as we discussed, could be a big controversial. But our source material seems to suggest that it can be a valuable tool if it's used carefully. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. So strategic industrial policy is essentially about the government taking a more proactive role in shaping the economy, by supporting specific industries that are seen as having the potential for future growth and strategic importance, and this sport can take many forms. It can be things like providing tax breaks, investing in research and development, creating favorable regulatory environments.
Right. I can see how this approach could be beneficial, especially in industries that are, crucial to national security or economic competitiveness.
Hmm.
But as we discussed earlier, there are also concerns about, the government picking winners and losers and the potential for cronyism and corruption.
Yeah.
How can we mitigate those risks?
Yeah, those are valid concerns, and that's why it's crucial. If we're going to do this, to have clear criteria for selecting which industries to support transparent decision-making processes, strong oversight mechanisms to prevent abuse. It's also important to have what's called a sunset clause, meaning that the support would automatically expire after a certain period unless there's clear evidence that it's working.
So it's about being strategic and selective and having safeguards in place to ensure that the program is achieving its intended goals.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that strategic industrial policy isn't a new idea.
Mm.
Many countries, including the U.S., have used it successfully in the past. Think about the role that the government played, in the early development of the internet or the aerospace industry. These were strategic investments that paid off handsomely in the long run.
So it's not about the government trying to, micromanage the economy. It's about making smart, targeted investments that can create, long-term benefits for the country.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from our deep dive today. There are alternatives to tariffs. We don't have to choose between protectionism and a completely unfettered free market. There's a middle ground where we can create a more dynamic, equitable, and sustainable economy.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening conversation, and I think you've done a fantastic job of breaking down, these complex issues in a way that's both informative and engaging. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, discussing these important issues with you. And as always, we encourage our listeners to continue exploring these topics on their own. The source material we've discussed today is just a starting point. There's a wealth of information out there, and we encourage you to dive deeper, challenge your own assumptions, form your own conclusions.
Well said, and with that, we'll bring this deep dive to a close.
Thanks for joining us.